Welcome to the Central Ideas podcast. This is Marius Unvik. Today I'm going to be speaking with Brittany Kempker and Stephen Clayton. Brittany is a junior at Central Methodist University, and Stephen is a senior at Central Methodist University. He is currently writing his bachelor's degree thesis on the relationship between violent behavior and video games. They're both majoring in psychology and are both members of Psychology Club. Hello guys, welcome to Central Ideas. How are you guys doing?
Good.
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Today we're going to discuss the sexual aspect of the social fabric. We're going to go into marriage, polygamy, monogamy, and how it used to be and how it is. And we're going to connect these to different psychological theories of pleasure, meaning, and power. Brittany, could you tell us a little bit what polygamy and monogamy are and how prevalent they are in human societies or have been throughout time?
Sure. So polygamy is having multiple partners, and that splits into two different parts, such as polyandry, which is one wife, and multiple men, which is less common than polygyny, which is one husband and multiple wives. And monogamy is simply having one partner. And throughout history, human societies, there are 85% of societies that have at some point been polygamy societies.
Okay, and this is according to an article all of us read together called The Puzzle of Monogamous Marriage, where two extremely accomplished scientists, Robert Boyd and Peter Richardson, they're both among top 97% of all scientists on ResearchGate.net. So these are the authors of this article on polygamy and monogamy. And it might be safe to assume that the reason why men are more likely to have several wives than women are to have several husbands might be because of how the women can always know that they're producing their kid, while the man, he can't really know if his wife has like 5 husbands, if that really is his child. So it leads to things like jealousy and anxiety and a lack of what most men throughout history feel like is their responsibility, I think. Stephen, how and why do you think monogamy came about in the first place? Why have just one partner?
That is an interesting question. If I've read correctly and kind of understand the basis of monogamy, there is at least some element that is related to religion. And it seems to be there's a great intertwining between Christianity and monogamy. And with that, of course, Christianity is spread throughout history like wildfire. And I would suggest that at least part of monogamy's popularity and its explosion into modern society deals with that sort of explosion of Christianity too. Maybe not necessarily perfectly intertwined, but at least there would be some relationship between them. And as for the function of it, it does appear to work really well among societies that don't have an excessive need for multiple children. Societies that are more in line with first world countries. You don't have to worry about multiple children being victim to disease or famine or poverty as much as you would in countries that are less developed. The function could be something related to the family structure being a bit more focused on development rather than acquisition of resources. That's a little bit of speculation on my part and a bit of what I've understand about the history of monogamy.
Okay. Yes, the religion is definitely important here. One would certainly think that when religion is so important to us, that would make people more interested in having just one partner according to what their religion teaches. But there might also be a biological reason for why we just want to have one partner. The reason I ask is because, evolutionarily speaking, we would think that as many offspring as you can produce is the best number, right? Like if you can get 100 kids as a man, uh, your genes probably are much more likely to survive, um, as they live on to the next generation, and as most of them probably will live on to the next generation once again. The reason why I'm talking about a different biological uh, reason for why people might engage in monogamy is actually because it might affect our brains to have more than one partner. It might, if let's assume that our fundamental drive in life is pleasure. If that is our fundamental drive, then several partners is totally rational. If pleasure is the fundamental drive, why not go around, have sex with as many people as possible, and get as many kids? Why not? Well, if we think that, like Viktor Frankl thought, that our fundamental drive in life is meaning, one might think that it's better to just have one partner because you have more time with that partner. Then you can give that partner your attention, your love more fully if you just have one partner. So which one of these two, polygamy and monogamy, do you guys think is more useful for society?
What I would suggest is that it can depend on the society itself. However, if we're talking a first world country or a first world nation, I would suggest that monogamy is a bit more useful. The practice is, it can have a bit better of an outcome in terms of health for the child, and it's also a bit better in terms of sexual health. Because if you reduce down the amount of partners by which you have sex with, you're drastically reducing your risk of getting an STI or STD. It creates, sort of in some ways, a stability too. And that is very fundamental when it comes to the actual development of, generally speaking, people. As for polygamy, I could see it potentially functioning very well in, again, those nations of lesser development. Just because in that same regard, if you're in a nation that is constantly war-torn, it could be a sort of way to replenish an army. Or it could also be a way to ensure that you have enough workers to build up crops and acquire resources. And also by sheer numbers, as you mentioned, that would give them a better chance of survival.
So what you're arguing in a sense is that it is sensible to have several offspring in some cases, which is viciously reflected in our history. 85%, as Brittany said, of all societies throughout history have been polygamous. Maybe it's a necessary precondition for monogamy to first go through a period of polygamy. Maybe that is just what we have to go through in order to achieve kind of the higher, I guess you could say, end of monogamy, and just having one partner and stability, as you mentioned, because that is, in a respect, what a monogamous relationship allows you to have. Stability, one partner to rely on, and one partner who can rely on you. It makes sense from a perspective of meaning in life. Exactly. Well, Brittany, considering how prevalent polygamy has been throughout history, how do you think, do you think we're seeing kind of a comeback through the immense hookup culture and promiscuity we see in our society today after the sexual revolution in the 60s?
I personally don't think that we're making a comeback when it comes to that, because I read an article that said that we are actually having less sex than we were even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the baby boomer generation. This article states that one of these could be due to the cause of the rise in porn. And from 1992 to 2014, the share of American men who reported masturbating in a given week doubled, and the share for women more than tripled. Easy access to porn is part of this story. And the reason why we are jumping so much and we aren't so much having sex with other people, then we have easier access to our own in our own free time.
Hmm.
And then I also don't think that we are necessarily more of a hookup culture. We may not be going to more polygamy, but monogamy, because if we find that our relationship isn't working or we find interest in somebody else, we can easily just get divorced and find another partner instead of cheating on that one partner.
Okay, so you're suggesting that because of the loose marriage boundaries today, how easy it is to get a divorce. Like you can pay $50,
Right.
sign the document.
50% of marriages end in divorce.
That's recent since our marriage laws have been extremely liberated. Do you guys think that there are positive and negative effects there, or just positive? What do you guys think about marriage laws in general after recent development? How does that affect the social fabric?
I feel like people are too easy to give up, and so it's more of we might as well as not get married in the first place anymore and be more of a we all belong to each other. We just go around and do as we please, with the pleasure principle instead of meaning and staying with another partner.
So you could say the institution of marriage, when that is weakened, we are less inclined to go and find long-lasting relationships, you think?
I think so.
Why do you think that is, though? Like, why does an official document and a ritual like a wedding, why do these factors actually influence a relationship? Like, what do you guys think are the reasons for that?
Well, I mean, even now, you don't have to have a big wedding. You can simply go to the courthouse and sign a piece of paper with 2 witnesses. And chances are, if you have a bigger wedding, you're more likely to stay married because you made that commitment in front of friends, family, bigger crowds versus simply signing the piece of paper in front of a judge. And so I think that maybe if we stick to more bigger weddings and get rid of the simple court document signing, or even postpone like the marriage date until after 20 or so, we're less likely to get divorced.
That sound like those ideas sound like they perhaps could work. I don't see that society would stand by them. I do feel like there is a social, it's not unanimous, but I do think that there's a social inclination towards having these liberated wedding laws, considering our history and how a woman back in the day struggled more to leave a partner. But I guess no one really could leave someone they were married to, so it went both ways, and then they just kept fighting, and it went worse and worse, and they couldn't leave. This was probably immensely difficult, but I don't think our legislators thought long and hard about what would happen if they made these wedding laws so liberated and so, you could say, loosened up.
But getting married back in way long ago was such a big deal that if you were gay, you still got married to someone of the opposite sex anyways, because getting married was such a big deal that if you died alone or if you were alone, then there was something incredibly wrong with you.
Many people probably thought so, yes. And also we've always had benefits to those who get married, like economic benefits. But I do think that we actually established the rituals of, these are just my speculations, you could say. I think we developed these rituals because we found that there might be a goal that's long term in it and not just a convenience of finding a partner and having sex and then leaving. Like there's something about it, kind of constructing something in that ritual that we're going to tear down if we don't respect it. Stephen, how do you think the fragility of marriage today might affect children?
From everything I've learned throughout my numerous psychology courses, it's that in most cases a divorce is an incredibly difficult experience for children. It's usually an incredibly stressful time for them. And depending on the age, they may have a lot of issue processing what exactly is going on. To my understanding, too, this can also lead to a great deal of inter-family conflict due to the possibility of the parent in custody moving on, and of course the dangers of introducing a new person to be a figure in this child's life. As for the fragility of marriage in the bigger picture, I would dare to say that the unfortunate reality of creating a fragile marriage kind of establishes a different social norm than what we have now. By doing so, this could create a future in which there is even less value placed on it, and I would dare to say that that may actually be what's happening now, with an actual decline in the total number of marriages occurring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why sign up to something that 50% of people are likely to quit?
Yeah.
It's a good question to ask. Like, why would you do it? It's a deep question, and I do think that because of its fundamental value throughout history, I think we're playing with fire, turning our back on marriage, and because there's a bond you can reach in a marriage that you probably can approximate in a relationship where you just live with your partner without being officially married. But when you get married, you agree, and throughout most history, on the promise of your religion and your life, that you're going to stay with that person for the rest of your life. You promise it, and you're more inclined then to stay with your partner than when you don't promise it, and when it's really easy to break it apart, because a lot of people are really impulsive and they might just cut it off after one fight, and that can happen today. It's probably not as usual as we think, but maybe it is, actually. Maybe it really is. I would add to your point on children there that I'm not sure it's better to get a divorce than to have a home where you fight a lot. But maybe it is. Maybe stability is better than chaos, despite the frustration and anxiety you have in a home. Not necessarily, and there are exceptions, obvious exceptions. Violence in a home obviously makes a big difference. But when it's not a violent home, and when we're just talking to people who are not managing to stick together as well as they used to, maybe they should do so for the kids who do not have a vote. They never had a vote. Today they're more respected, and their rights are more respected than before, but technically they're still not considered eligible, you could say, to vote on what their parents should do, because that's their freedom. Yeah, their short-term freedom, that is. Maybe long-term in some cases too.
Mm-hmm. To kind of speculate a bit, when it comes to the idea of a marriage sticking together for the children, at least from what I remember in a course taught by Dr. Anson, the Family Relationships and Values course, marriages that stick together for the children do seem to lead to similar negative outcomes. Not necessarily similar to a polygamous relationship, but in that it can be hindering to the child's development. I could potentially see, from my understanding, where it would be a sort of double-edged sword, where having that stability can kind of help create a value within the child's mind of, if you are with someone and you agree to marry them, that you stick by them. But then, in the future, if they enter into a similar relationship, which is not too uncommon with how children do typically model after their parents.
In many respects.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if they seek out a relationship similar to their parents, it's a vicious cycle in which the children will be almost continuing the history where there is just this unhappy life where there's commitment, but there's not necessarily any passion or actual love there.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of harkening back to Sternberg's idea of the triangle of, or pyramid of love, where they would have one of the aspects, but the rest of them would not be there.
Mhm.
Which, in his idea of love, it would not be a sound relationship.
I certainly think you're making a lot of sense. But I still think that there's it's not always about how they feel and what they model after. It's also that they have role models in general, and the case is today. I think I remember Thomas Sowell saying that I think it's about 70% of blacks in the U.S. Uh, are households with just a mother and children, and not with male role model for the children. And I think personally that's not good for a society, because you need both a role model for, if you're a boy especially, for a male role model, a father, and a female role model if you're a girl, or actually just in general. I think it's nice to have both. And when you're a boy in the inner city and you go to school, most likely your teacher is going to be a woman as well. So you're not even going to have a role model in school, which is an important agent of socialization, really important. And I can just imagine this perpetuating, and eventually a lot of kids are just going to live with a single mom, which is much more difficult for the mom than if she had more stability. It just is. It's more challenging. You don't have as much time because you have to run around and both work and have an income, but also watch out for your kids and help them develop and all that. So maybe you won't have time to fulfill that role that the father could fulfill. So that's an aspect that we often forget, I think. Because we often today believe that men and women are the same, and they're very similar in many respects, but they're also very different in others. Personality, for example. And I think we've lost touch with that tough love in society today. We're really scared of words, even on college campuses, safe spaces, where we think we're so fragile, but human beings are not fragile. And we're going to get back to Viktor Frankl later, and I'll demonstrate how people are really much stronger than they actually think. So we've discussed kind of the implications of society, the social fabric breaking down a little bit with marriage. Brittany, you mentioned this everyone belongs to everyone idea. I want to explore that a little bit. That's Aldous Huxley's quote from his book Brave New World. And I can imagine a future where we're all about that notion that everyone does belong to everyone, and you can go and have sex with anyone you'd like. And what do you think would be the implications of that, if that's where we're going?
I think that if we're actually going that route, we could have a lot more problems in the future. There's going to be a lot of kids, I'd say probably in the foster system. No one wants to lay claim on anybody. No one wants to put their financial support in these kids because you can't prove that it's yours. Nobody wants to take care of it. And so that could really play a big role on society in the future. And then if we take it down a physical road of like the spread of STDs, we could have a huge comeback of increasing HIV or AIDS, really big increases in all this stuff. And although we have medications to treat a lot of other diseases, gonorrhea, chlamydia, that kind of stuff, we could have different strands that it grows to be immune to it, and we have different strands that might get spread around, and eventually it could be back whenever HIV first came out, and you had a couple months to live, and that's it.
Oh no, it's definitely possible that diseases can evolve, and because that we've seen it happen. That's one of the biggest fears in the medical community, as far as I'm concerned, that we're using so many antibiotics that bacteria build up resistance. Yeah.
Right.
I want to share with you something I discovered, you could say, this week or last week. I think it might have been. My uncle and I, we were discussing this biological tool called CRISPR. Are you familiar with that tool? It's a gene modification tool. Regardless, so he was telling me how we had this relatively new technology today, and we were discussing what effect that could have on us as a society if we dared to mess with human genes. The day after we talked, I see an article that a Chinese scientist has carried out this operation on two twins that are now born. So they've actually carried out human gene modifications in China today. And the reason why I brought this up was because what they actually took out was an AIDS gene. Yeah. So we weren't going to discuss this initially, but that's frightening to me.
Right. Even with the technology today, there's such thing as test tube babies, which sounds terrible, but artificial insemination can have so many complications still, and it's been around for a while. And so, you can have a lot of things go wrong. And so with this, who's to say what could really go wrong if we start really messing with genes?
Yes, and especially in China, they have this system, mass surveillance system, like literally 1984 George Orwell, literally, where they get social credit points for their behavior. So if they buy more alcohol than a specific limit, they lose points, and those points gain. With those points, you gain advantages in society. So, for example, if you have 800, which I think is the maximum score, you're allowed to leave the country and go on vacations. You get a house that you don't have to pay a mortgage on. Many advantages. But if you're on the low end of the distribution, you're not allowed to leave the country. You don't get a seat on the train. Yeah. And those are just some of the things you might lose. And if you criticize the government, you also lose points. So I can imagine, this was just a thought that struck me when I heard this, in the future, maybe 5 years hence, where those with a high score are allowed to pick out the height of the kid, the eye color, the hair color, when we can, the IQ, which is likely we'll figure out sometime, as most of our stuff, most of the stuff that belongs to a human being is nested in our genes. So I think we're playing with fire.
I don't think humans can be trusted enough to be able to make decisions about this.
Me neither.
I don't think that anyone should have that power.
Yeah, no, it's a massive power. And I can only imagine that the U.S. is going to follow up on this because they kind of have to. China is their greatest competitor economically in the market and militarily as well. So, I mean, troops, gene-modified troops.
Yep.
It's frightening, huh?
In some ways, you could almost argue that the idea of genetically modifying troops, it sounds kind of, again, just to add a little levity to this, it sounds like they're quite literally working toward making Captain America. To where it's someone that is this genetically modified being that is supposed to be this ideal where they're muscular, they're very capable, have high endurance. And that is a really terrifying thought.
Mm-hmm.
Because the question that I would ask, is it ethical if you are going to genetically modify the genes of a to-be-born baby? Is there a removal of consent?
That's the thing. And it kind of goes back to this other idea, but just that they don't even have a voice. Like, they don't even have a voice, and they're born with, these kids are born with a gene removed, which I've heard, and I can't verify this, has other uses than just an AIDS gene. It also has, like, according to this one source I read on, I think, livescience.com, it has a use for preventing other diseases, like infectious diseases. And I can't verify that, but we are so eager to go out and make big changes, do things that we think will help society, like breaking up these marriage laws, like making everything more liberated. But maybe, and just maybe, we're just playing with fire all along. Maybe it never was a good idea to break up the marriage laws as quick as we did. Maybe we should have been more careful. And maybe now that's just a precursor to what we're doing here in China. And we are entering Aldous Huxley's world when we produce children out of the womb. Because that is exactly what he portrayed in his opening scenes. They produce kids in factories who play erotic games when they're young, like 8 years old. The kids play erotic games. And this is extremely, it seems strange to us now, but who the hell knows where we're going to go with this.
Right, and if we stay on this path and everyone even gets the same genes, because everyone's going to want the best, you're going to want to have the tallest, the strongest, the smartest, and everything. The competition between classes is going to change. And then who's to say we're not going to get even more weak, as we had talked about, of fragile, if everyone's the exact same? Then if someone criticizes you, it's going to be a completely different society setup than what we are.
Yeah, and that's true. I'm not sure we would pick all the same. We're very different people still. People have different wants and needs for their kids, but I would assume that, yeah, they would want them to be strong and smart and all those things, but they would have some other variations. But people do also tend to copy each other and imitate each other as well. So it's hard to say exactly where we would take that. What I am fearing, though, is that when we enter this ultimate domain of pleasure, this pornography, this all this masturbation and everything, and as we're going to get into with you later, Stephen, video games and everything, maybe we're making ourselves much more invested in the realm of pleasure than we usually were. Losing these meaningful relationships among wives and husbands, but also among fathers and sons, and mothers and their offspring. We're losing this in many respects when we're making ourselves so socially vulnerable. We're breaking up the fabric, and I'm not sure we have the right tools to reconstruct it. How are we to reconstruct it? If we just legislate laws, people are going to change them, because there is a strong inclination to be free. But maybe it's the wrong kind of freedom. Maybe freedom is what we deeply want and not just what we want in the immediate sense. Maybe that is actually real freedom, to wait and build up things with other people and with, yeah.
A similar idea would be kind of the notion of delayed gratification. And that has been, at least from what I've heard, in studies done on it, it appears that that actually is related at least to, if not a better life in terms of how they view their life. Because by delaying that gratification, you're more ensured a sort of grand payout. Why spend $10 now and get food from McDonald's when you could save for a month, spend $100 and get a very nice luxury food, one that's probably your favorite as opposed to McDonald's.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it would be important to consider that, and that is another idea that may be going on with why marriages seem to crumble so quickly. There is that sort of lack of, or at least I would dare to suggest there may be a lack of consideration for the longest term. Because if you don't consider, this is the person that I'm going to be waking up to for the next 60 years, I need to ensure that I have picked someone who is both good for me and that I am good for. And if you make a decision in the heat of the moment or in the heat of passion, you risk a fair chance of not getting to truly know that person. And that's not even considering that for the most part, we're dynamic beings. Who we are in 5 years is not who we were 5 years ago.
Yeah, we're always changing. Some of us stay more than same than others, but in general, we always change. And I would add to your concern of this, you could say, lack of delaying gratification, this ultimate, you could say, we're sprinting towards the first little hit of dopamine we can get. We see this every day on your social media. The first thing you do when you wake up, I can almost, yeah, I can see your smile. The first thing you do is pick up your phone, get on Snapchat, Facebook, whatever, and get those little dopamine hits in when you see a like, or when you see a funny meme, or when you get a snap from your from a girl, or from someone you like, or from your boyfriend, or whoever. You know that it's pleasurable, and we always have our phones with us. Always. Almost always we have that phone in our pocket or in our hand, and it's controlling many aspects of us. And by adding more of these small gadgets, and by restricting, no, by eliminating the restrictions on pleasure, we're becoming engulfed in pleasure. We're so distracted. People, when they try to read, sit with their phones right next to them, and bing, their phone goes off, and they pick up their phone, and they're not reading anymore. They're not studying. Of course, there are people who can control themselves, but we're much less inclined to now because of this abundance of technology, of pleasure-inducing technologies, you could say. And it's, I don't know where we're going with it, but to me, it seems like we're still playing with fire. There are many good uses for technology. Many. I can't tell you how many things I've looked up on my phone and learned from just having that little tool. But maybe sometimes things that we think are good are more preventative to good. Plato thought that pleasure is at least as obstructive to true wisdom as pain is. He thinks pleasure is as obstructive to true wisdom as pain is. And that's a radical idea, because you wouldn't think so. But then you think of the alcoholic. He's always trying to get his pleasure. Yes, he ends up in pain in the morning, but that's the price you pay for pleasure over deep delayed gratification activities, such as building relationships, such as having difficult conversations online like we are right now. We don't have to do this. We could sit home, play video games, watch Netflix, but we're out here trying to discuss things, trying to figure things out, trying to contemplate why we're here, what we're doing here, the good, the bad that we're doing, the constructive and the destructive. When it comes to pornography, Stephen, it's interesting. Brittany said that we have less sex, though. Now, you are studying how video games affect us, and other things as well, but could you tell me if there's kind of a relationship here, like when people watch more sex, do they have less of it? But we always hear in the media that when you play more video games, you're more violent and stuff. What has your research shown on this?
Well, actually, through a book review by Covert and Quant, when they sort of aggregated numerous studies on video games, they actually found that, contrary to what media says, it appears that the more video games we have consumed, societal youth violence and crime has actually declined. There's a negative relationship between them. It may be the case that, and this is a popular speculation among my research, that in some ways video games can be a sort of outlet for those emotions.
So like a channel through which your violent urges, run through.
And in doing so...
Like angry music.
Yes.
In a sense.
Exactly. And in doing so, maybe by having that channel through which they can express that emotion, and with it being a less destructive means than going out and just committing vandalous acts, tearing up property, it kind of helps keep them withdrawn or reined in. It could be the case that pornography functions in a similar way, in which people use that as a means to express their sexual frustrations, or maybe it's just a sort of in the moment want to have that pleasure, to where it keeps them from going out and seeking someone else. In some ways, it would be a bit easier to just simply go onto the internet, search up a website with pornographic material.
Pick from the never-ending buffet, you could say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it removes a lot of the attempts to find a person that would be willing and consenting to the same ideas.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's removed all aspects of that, but it is, in some ways, a sort of way to remove the personal element from it and just have that in the moment.
Just the images, right? Just the visuals. Do you think though that we can get into the violence in video games in a while, but do you think that pornography has negative effects as well on us, apart from just not being out as much and having sex as much, or things like that? Do you think it has negative effects on us too?
Absolutely.
Like addiction and stuff?
In terms of addiction, absolutely. This actually could kind of be related in the way that video games function, where the behavior creates a release of dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
Our brains are really hardwired to like dopamine.
Yes.
And pornography being related to sex, that's something that our brains are biologically wired to like. Generally speaking, there are, of course, people who don't, and that's not to say that they're improperly made, but with that sort of relationship, it can create an addiction. Maybe not in the ways that people assume addiction begins by, the obtaining of a substance that then alters the brain state.
Mm-hmm.
It could actually be more of a creation of dependence on the feeling of it.
Yes.
To where it creates a sort of
and the release of other fluids and everything like that.
Exactly. To where it creates a kind of cyclical behavior and dependence.
Positive feedback loop.
Yep.
Yeah, and that is what an addiction probably is in general. It's a relationship you have with something, a substance or technology or something. It could be someone as well. People get addicted to things like sex, not just porn, but sex itself. That makes sense, of course. So it doesn't have to be something you pump into your body. It can, for humans, since we're conscious, it can simply be something you're experiencing, something merely abstract in a sense, like playing video games. But you're saying, well, although video games might not make us more violent, do you think video games have other destructive elements than just that?
Absolutely. Actually, what I feel is probably the most important findings of my research so far is that video games actually appear to be, they can function as a negative coping mechanism, wherein by turning to video games, you are essentially escaping from the stresses of your life. And in doing so, that is a maladaptive behavior, but particularly if it occurs over a long-term period, which would come back to it being a video game addiction. By having that sort of dependence on video games, that will translate into other methods of approaching stresses. To where if, say it's just one example, you're stressed from a long day of work, you come home to play video games. After time, that may translate to you going, okay, I'm stressed about how this person is acting around me. I'm going to turn to video games. Maybe not necessarily a slippery slope, but a creation of dependence, which that it's very unhealthy to approach life where your idea of dealing with stressors is to push them off.
Run away from it.
Yep.
it's the opposite of what the clinicians say about how you should approach your fears. They literally say that you should engage with what you're scared of when you're ready for it.
Yes.
But you should try to be ready for it all the time. Engage it voluntarily. And I want to add a little metaphor here from Jordan Peterson, Dr. Jordan Peterson. He talks of video games and pornography by inducing the example of Peter Pan. Peter Pan was the king, or is the king, of the Lost Boys in Neverland. He beats Captain Hook, and he's king. Everyone likes him, but he's dating Tinkerbell. Yeah, he's the king of Neverland. Is that the people we want to be? The king of an imaginary domain? Or do we want the real world? Do we want to conquer real things, or just live in a dream of video games and in pre-recorded videos of sexual intercourse? Is that what we want? Do we want to be Peter Pan, or do we want to return to the real world for a minute and actually deal with our issues that will never go away until we deal with them? What do we want to do?
That is an interesting question, and I would dare to say that those seeking that escape, I would assume that they probably do not want to just immerse themselves into a fake world. There are people who are genuinely passionate. I've read of people who have played video games so much it actually killed them. A South Korean video game player, he played for, I believe it was 60 hours straight, trying to practice for a tournament. And when he stood up, he suffered from a blood clot in his legs that shot straight to his lungs and heart. So there are people that may want that fake world, but they need to recognize that that may not be the healthiest choice.
Mm-hmm.
In the short term, again, that could be beneficial. In fact, at least one of my sources mentioned that by distracting the brain for a short term, it actually can help increase focus when you return to the task that is stressing.
Mm-hmm. So some level of video games could be good, because it's similar to reading, actually. If you're playing like a story, you're living out someone else's story, you're doing things, you're acting in a little imaginary domain. Maybe some porn is good as well. Who knows? The problem is, though, that when you always have it there in your living room, in your room, like I always did back in the day, 6, 7, 8 hours a day I played video games. When it's always there, you always want to be in there and walk around and kill zombies or whatever else you do, conquer the Nazis in some strategy game. That's what you end up doing, probably. We would definitely have to go back and talk about this one time, because it's very interesting, but we have to move on. So, Brittany, could you link what we've been talking about to these theories of Freud's pleasure principle, perhaps a little bit of Adler's power theory as well?
I did not read much about this, but I do know a little bit about Freud's pleasure principle. I don't know that we necessarily are going directly for pleasure. I don't think that there's really a power play in anything. I think that, if anything, men and women are starting to be more equal in relationships and things. It's not necessarily that men are, out there choosing directly the females that are willingly throwing themselves at men. It's more even of people trying to find people who are also equal to them in the same class and everything, that just make better fits. I think that there's still a little bit pleasure principle. I don't think that that's what runs how we do things anymore. I think that meaning is taking over, and that we are trying to spend time with more than with the one person. Even though divorce rate is so high, we still have that one person. I think that we're too quick to jump to the label of getting married, but I do still think that everyone's still out there searching for their one and only Prince Charming.
Do you think that could be, though, that we're not actually obtaining meaning, but we're yearning for it deep inside?
Right.
Could that be it?
Right.
Because I'm not sure we're getting it. But maybe there's like a desperation in us, and that's why we're always breaking up relationships, because we want this Prince Charming, or we want the princess, or whoever we want. We want someone that's right for us, and we're willing to run people down almost and ruin families for it. Maybe we're just so desperately in need of a meaning in life that that's what we're going for.
Right, and we're so quick to, if one person doesn't work out, we're on to the next one the next day. And
many people do that.
Right, you keep going until you find someone that is right for you, you're right for them, and you can put up with them, and then if that doesn't work, you get divorced and you keep searching. It's not necessarily like we don't really go on dates anymore. It's more you see them one time, you hook up with them, and if things don't work out, then you break up and you move on.
We could probably shoot in Tinder and apps like that here as well. They certainly don't help out the building up relations in real life issue, because you don't have to do anything anymore. You just take a picture, put out your social profile, the best you've ever looked in a picture, a little title, the coolest thing you've ever said in a title, and a few things that you like about yourself, and nothing bad. You meet up with a person, you don't need to get to know them, and you just shoot in and have sex and leave. I think a lot of people do that, though, even though sex rates might go down. I think those who actually have sex, who are not in a relationship, they use these channels now.
Yeah, it's so much more. I actually read an article that we're classifying hookup by a different definition. As back in the day, hookup was strictly sex, whether, either oral sex or any sort of penetrative sex. Now, hooking up can be, we went on a date, we made out for 20 minutes, we went to a party and we slept in the same bed, whether that's fully clothed or after you had sex. We're starting to see where hookup can mean a way wider range than normal.
All right.
And I think that's what started the hookup culture. Is it's more people are classifying, I hooked up with them, even though they might be, I spent the night fully clothed in their bed.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys think that might have something to do with the fact that back in the day, we used to be more what could you say, prude? We didn't see it as something you had to do to go out and have sex when you were young. But I certainly remember when I was back in middle school, you were really cool if you had sex or something like that. That was what people wanted to do. And that was what gave you status, in a sense. Both girls and guys, actually. There are exceptions and limitations there on like how many partners and everything, but I do think it's much more expected today that you're hooking up. So maybe people are employing that term to merely cover up the expectations. Do you think that might be possible?
Exactly, I do think it's possible. And coming from a girl's perspective in middle school, it wasn't, if you actually had sex with somebody, you crossed over that line of you're nasty or dirty, you're a slut. Whether you slept with one person or 10, it was more of like, you showed off your hickeys, you showed off any sort of thing. Like if he gave you a bracelet, that was the same thing as having sex. Versus if you actually had sex, you now cross that line. In middle school. Once you hit high school, the lines blurred a little bit. But then coming from any guy's perspective, if you gave a girl a bracelet to another guy, you are a prude. Why didn't you sleep with her? Why didn't you, now are you gay? Are you...
Yeah, even that stuff.
So many things that cross, and it's just different growing up.
There are many similarities, speaking from a foreigner's perspective, between high school, because I went to high school here for a year, and at home. But I do think the pressure is actually higher at home than here. I think it might have something to do with this being the Bible Belt of America, and there is a religious element to that as well. Prudeness goes together with this monogamy point, like sex and marriage are related, but sex and no marriage are not. And I think that's a really interesting idea because we think today, and based on everything we've said today, that sex can be divorced, no pun intended, from emotions, from other things. We think that it's just an act now. But no, it's not really just an act. Just because we have birth control and other contraceptives, we always run the risk of getting children when we have sex.
I don't think people think about that anymore.
They forget.
The
And
idea,
abortions as well.
right, and the idea that these are becoming more acceptable, like abortions are starting to go away, but that means you're starting to get more illegal abortions if we start making them illegal. And then now, as I've seen on Facebook and stuff, they're trying to come out with male birth controls, such as, like, lotions that you may rub on your arm or something before you have sex. Coming up with these new technologies, it's increasing the amount of free, willing sex that you can have without running such a great risk.
Yeah, so of course, I mean, that risk, also, it's a good thing that we're able to protect ourselves against such a risk, but that also might have negative consequences. Birth control. We're dealing with a lot of issues just because we have so many contraceptives today. Japan's birth rate is so low right now. It's like 0.4. And for those, 0.14. 1.4, I'm sorry. The necessary birth rate is 2.1 if you want to reproduce all your people. If you don't want to reproduce all your people, you go below that, and Japan is at 1.4. Many countries in Europe, 1.4, around that. So our populations are decreasing, and we have elderly waves from our great advances in medicine that are approaching us in the West and in the East. So I think, although it's great that people don't get kids every time they have sex now, there are unintended, latent consequences that might be worse in many respects. Maybe we won't have nurses at a certain point. Enough, that is. We'll always have a few, but it's a big problem. So we have to consider this, and I don't think people who made that legal back during the sexual revolution and spread it thought about these issues.
Right. I think we
deeply.
need to take into perspective when it comes to having kids. We are starting to look at the crisis of overpopulation and running out of resources and stuff, but we also have to think of back in our grandparents' day, back then, it was common to have 7 to 8 kids to run the farm, to run everything. With the growth of, all of the machine advances, and even McDonald's has where you go in and you order yourself, and the food comes, you type in your own order, you pay with your credit card. We don't need nearly as many people to work anymore. So the point of now you can only have, having 2 kids just to have your kids and fulfill that need is more common than having 8 kids and contributing to overpopulation or stuff like that.
And there is a strong correlation between health in societies and wealth. With having less children, it's very typical. People get children later in life and all that. And I'm not saying people should get 8 kids. That's not what I'm saying. My point is, though, that I think that we should not have a decreasing population. And I personally don't think we're overpopulated either. That's a Malthusian idea put forth back in the 1600s because our food production wasn't as scaled as it is today. Yes, there are countries with famine still, but more people die today of obesity than of famine and hunger and starvation.
And that comes to the kinds of food that we're producing. We don't have the fields that we had, the big, every family had their own fresh food garden in their front yard.
That's
because
right.
now we have more subdivisions, we have more apartment complexes to house people than to have free room for people to provide more nutritious food for their family.
Exactly, and we could go into this and talk for hours about how food might affect us, and there are many aspects here to touch on, but we can't today. One other time we can though. I want to move on. We mentioned briefly the pleasure principle. Stephen, could you just quickly lay out what Freud actually means by the pleasure principle? What he attributes it to?
If I've read correctly, it's a relationship between our id, that sort of inner devil saying this is what you need to have. And that has such a strong pull that it makes this case that you need to worry about your pleasure rather than you need to worry about anything relating to pain. You want to have an aversion to that. So the maximum amount of pleasure you can get with the least amount of pain, the id will always try and reach for that.
It's basically utilitarianism just put in our nature.
Yes.
Yeah, maximum pleasure, minimum pain. It's a drive. It's a deep drive in our unconscious. That's the easiest way to put it, I think. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because a lot of people think that our fundamental drives are not pleasure, but power. We're not going to go into that deeply. I don't think we have time for that either, but Adler thought that one of our fundamental drives was power, and I have talked to many people who think that people are all about power today. But the reason I brought up these 2 points is because I actually want to make more of a case for meaning. I've done this to some degree in previous podcasts as well, but let's kind of review why would meaning be more important for us than pleasure? What do you think, Stephen?
This is more or less actually speaking experientially, but when it comes down to it, there's a great deal of short-term pleasure as opposed to long-term pleasure. And through meaning, you can derive more of a longer-term pleasure, kind of in the sense that it's not delayed gratification, but if you have a bond with someone that you've known for 10 years versus a bond with someone you've known for a year, there's a great deal more meaning behind that. You have a lot more of a connection to them. And in some ways, that would actually be more beneficial. I don't want to say that there's a distinction between pleasures per se, but I would dare to make the case that there are some people that would actually prefer to draw pleasure from that meaning rather than just to draw pleasures of the body.
Yeah, and I guess we could kind of make a distinction here. The reason why I brought up meaning again is actually because I don't think they're necessarily the same. There is an underlying passion in meaning. But as we've been making the case today, we have come to see that it's more of a something you build up, something you have to actually work for. And I'm not talking about working a 7-hour shift and then going out to drink. That's, yeah, you work for it, but it doesn't take much. Viktor Frankl, he was actually offered a visa to the US in 1942. He was a Jew in Austria, so as everyone knows, the Nazis would capture him if they found him at that point. So he goes out and he's considering this offer. He doesn't want to leave his family behind, because why would you? Maybe for pleasure and your own gratification you would, but maybe you wouldn't for meaning. Well, what does he do? Well, he comes back home, and his father is there with a piece from a synagogue that was burnt down by the Nazis. On that piece, it was ingrained. The fifth commandment was ingrained, which is honor thy father and thy mother, and thy days will be long upon the land. So he decided to stay. But what happens to Frankl? Frankl lost all of his family in the concentration camps. All of them dead. He lived on his love for his wife. He didn't know she was dead at the time, but he was walking around in immense, what could you say? Intrinsic pleasure, just thinking about her love and thinking about her and what it means to actually face tragedy and suffering and take it on and take it and make it into something good. So he, as the sole survivor of his family after the war, goes on to make a career of talking about meaning in life. And as I said, I've been making this case throughout my other, to some extent throughout my other podcast episode as well. But I think it's very relevant here when we're talking about sexuality, because that really is what it is. You face suffering forthright and think that maybe you can overcome it. That is meaning. Meaning is not pleasure in itself. Meaning is fighting and then getting something that you want to fight for. It's not a passion in itself. It's like, yeah, it's probably built on a certain passion because we want to be happy, but happy comes as an end to that. It's not a means. It's an end. It comes as a consequence. It ensues a meaningful pursuit. So pleasure is good, but we can't always be happy. You know this yourself. You have everything you need almost in this life. Mm-hmm. Almost everything. I've said this before too. Electricity, hot water, video games. We have pornography. Personally, don't use it. Don't need it. It's not worth it for me. But anyways, we have everything we need. All kinds of pleasures all the time, and I don't think we're more happy than other people are who don't have it. I don't think we are.
It may be the case actually that those with less may actually experience a bit higher happiness, because if you're looking for that meaning in life, it is more meaningful to be someone contributing to the welfare of your family and country by directly working on, say, crops, or directly putting yourself into the line of fire, as opposed to being those living in comfort.
Yeah, so being strong, taking responsibility, they are kind of the, you could say, capstones of meaning. You need to start by being responsible and take on the world, I guess.
My friend Joey, he went on to a military career. And he didn't do it for the pay. He was a smart guy. He could go on to college and get a degree. But a lot of his underlying motivation came down to wanting to do something good for the people he loves. That is in itself a pleasure, but you can't say that he was doing it for the pleasure. Basic training, a simulated deployment into the Mojave Desert, all of these immense tortures in some sense, for the sake of doing something.
Yes.
There's something underneath that, and you can't say that it's pleasure. He may obtain and get some gratification from it, but if there was nothing behind it, I'm betting to say he and everyone else who does the similar act, they wouldn't do it. There has to be something there.
Yeah, there is something there for sure.
And it can't just be pleasure. There may be some people that do want power.
Yeah.
But the meaning behind it is always going to be more magnified.
Yeah. And also when you're willing to risk your life for something, maybe you're not doing it for power. Because why the hell would you want power if you're dead? You don't need it. So I think that's definitely true. There's a reason why people take these risks and take on these responsibilities. It's not, as you say, they're tortured, man. Studying 8 hours a day, it's not like you're filled with pleasure as you are when you get a nicotine buzz or alcohol, an alcohol high or whatever you call it, an alcohol effect. It's not the same. It's just not the same. But it's worthwhile. It's fulfilling. And every time you do something meaningful, you can tell, because you lose track of the time. You lose track of the time. Well, guys, I think there are a lot of other things we could discuss today. But I think we will have to postpone it till next time. This has been very, very great, and I appreciate you guys coming on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.